Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling, well, one of the most fundamental processes in all of biochemistry. It's all about how life manages its own information.
Right, the topic is the regulation of gene expression. And it's so crucial because it answers that one big question. If the DNA in almost all your cells is identical, why is a neuron so different from a skin cell?
That really is the heart of it, isn't it? The genetic information itself is mostly static. The real magic, the key to development and adaptation, isn't what's in the blueprint.
It's when and how much of that blueprint gets read. The whole challenge for an organism is to regulate genes perfectly in response to, developmental cues, environmental stress, or even disease.
And that brings us right to the clinical side of things.
Absolutely, because when gene expression goes wrong, that's not just a neat academic problem, that's the direct cause of human disease. A growth signal gets stuck in the on position and you get cancer.
Or something like trisomy 21, Down syndrome, where an entire extra chromosome throws off the dosage of hundreds of genes.
Exactly. The whole regulatory network gets unbalanced. So if you can understand the molecular knobs and switches, you can start to design targeted drugs.
And when we think of regulation, it's easy to just picture a simple on-off switch for transcription. But the sources make it clear that it's much more complex.
Oh, way more. Think of it less like a light switch and more like a whole factory assembly line.
Mm-hmm.
Every single station, from pulling the blueprint out of the archive to the final product rolling off the line, has a point of control.
So that includes things like the number of gene copies, actually rearranging the DNA.
All the way to how the RNA message is modified, how long it lasts, how efficiently it's translated, and even the lifespan of the final protein. It's all regulated.
Okay, so to get us all on the same page, let's establish some basic language. The sources describe two main types of control.
Right. You have positive regulation, where something like an enhancer or an activator protein comes in and boosts gene expression.
And then the opposite, negative regulation, where a silencer or a suppressor protein steps in and dampens it down.
And the timing of these responses can be completely different, depending on what the cell needs. The sources lay out three main patterns. Let's start with type A.
Type A seems the most straightforward. The response is totally dependent on a signal being there.
Exactly. Think of bacteria swimming into a new food source.
Yeah.
Or maybe a hormone that has a very short-term effect. You apply the signal, the gene turns on, you take the signal away.
And the gene turns off. Simple.
Then you have type B. This is more of a transient in and out response, even if the signal sticks around. You see this a lot in development.
So the cell gets a signal, it responds for a little while, and then it sort of tunes it out, desensitizes itself.
Precisely. It responds, desensitizes, and then recovers, ready for the next instruction. It's a pulsive activity, not a continuous one.
And then the most dramatic one, the type C response.
Yeah, this one is the irreversible trigger. The signal comes in, flips the switch, and that's it. The new state of gene expression is locked in, and it's even passed down to all the daughter cells. This is how you get permanent tissue differentiation. It's a one-way street.
To really understand these systems, we have to start where it all began, with the simplest models, the prokaryotes.
We're going to E. coli and the famous lac operon. This was the foundational work by Jacob and Monod back in 1961. It's just a beautiful system.
So in bacteria, you have these things called operons.
Right. An operon is a set of genes that all work in the same pathway, and they're all grouped together and controlled as a single unit. And the mRNA they produce is called polycistronic.
Meaning one long mRNA molecule actually codes for multiple different proteins. In this case, LAC-Z, LAC, and LAC.
Exactly. And the whole goal here is just pure efficiency. The bacterium only wants to make the enzymes to digest lactose if its favorite food, glucose, isn't around.
And the first layer of control for that is negative. It involves a protein called the LAC-I repressor.
The gene for this repressor, LAC-I, is what we call constitutive. It's basically always on, just churning out this protein. The protein subunits then assemble into a tetramer, a repressor complex.
Now, what's really amazing to me is the physics of this interaction. The LAC-I repressor binds to a very specific 21 base pair sequence on the DNA, the operator, and the affinity is just staggering.
It's almost unbelievably tight. A dissociation constant around 10 to the minus 13 molar. It means when that repressor binds, it physically blocks the promoter. RNA polymerase just can't get on. The system is locked off.
So that's the default state, off.
But if lactose shows up, a version of it, allolactose, acts as an inducer. It binds directly to the lac-I repressor.
And that binding causes a shape change in the protein,
A
right?
huge conformational change.
Yeah.
And it ruins the repressor's ability to bind DNA. Its affinity for the operator drops by 10,000 times. It just falls right off.
Which means RNA polymerase can now bind the promoter and start transcribing. This is called de-repression.
But it's weak. You only get a little bit of transcription. The cell doesn't want just a trickle. It wants to go full blast, but only if it's sure that glucose is gone.
So it needs a second signal, a positive signal.
And that's where catabolite repression comes in. This system is run by another protein, the catabolite activator protein, or CAP.
And CAP needs a partner molecule, cyclic AMP or CAMP.
Right, when glucose levels are high, CMP levels are kept very low, so CAP is inactive. But when glucose disappears, CMP levels shoot up. CMP binds to CAP, forming the active CAP complex.
Okay, and what does this active complex do?
It binds to a site on the DNA just upstream of the promoter, and then, this is the key part, it makes direct physical contact with RNA polymerase, helping to recruit it and lock it onto the promoter. It just turbocharges the rate of initiation.
So it's perfect logic gate. You only get maximum expression when you have two conditions met. One, lactose is present, so the repressor is off.
And two, glucose is absent, so the CMP activator is on. You need both keys to really open the floodgates.
It's so elegant. Now let's move to a system that makes an even more permanent decision, a type C response.
We're looking at bacteriophage lambda. This is a virus that infects bacteria, and it has to make a choice. Go into the dormant lysogenic state and hide in the host's genome, or go into the latinic state, replicate like crazy, and burst the cell.
A life or death decision. And the control panel for this is a tiny 80 base pair stretch of DNA called the right operator, or OR.
Yep. It has 3 operator sites in a row, OR1, OR2, and OR3. And it's flanked by 2 key genes, CI, which makes the repressor protein, and CRO. The whole game is about which of these 2 proteins wins.
So let's say the phage wants to be dormant, the lysogenic state.
Then the CI repressor has to be in charge. The CI dimer loves to bind to OR1. And when it binds there, it actually helps another CI dimer bind next OR to OR2. It's cooperative.
And the CI protein is really clever. It does 2 jobs at once.
It really is. By sitting on OR1, it physically blocks the promoter for the CRO gene. That's its job as a negative regulator. But at the same time, the CI protein bound at OR2 actually helps RNA polymerase bind to the promoter for its own gene, the CI gene.
So it's also a positive regulator for itself. It creates a positive feedback loop to keep itself in power and maintain that dormant state.
Exactly. It's a very stable situation. So to flip the switch and go embolytic, you have to break that loop.
What's the trigger for that?
A major stress signal, like UV light, which causes DNA damage.
Yeah.
This activates a bacterial protease called RESI.
And RESA's job is to chop up the CI repressor.
It cleaves it. And the fragments can't bind to the DNA anymore. They fall off OR1 and OR2. And the instant that happens, the promoter for the CRO gene is wide open.
So RNA polymerase jumps on and starts making CRO protein.
Right, and CRO has the opposite preference. The CRO dimer binds most tightly to OR3. And what does sitting on OR3 do?
It blocks the promoter for the CI gene.
It shuts off CI production completely. The switch is thrown, and it's irreversible. The system is now locked into the relytic pathway.
So these simple bacterial and phage systems show us how just a few modular proteins can create these incredibly sophisticated switches. But what happens when you move to eukaryotes, where the DNA itself is, buried?
That is the fundamental challenge. The default state for many eukaryotic genes isn't just off, it's inaccessible. The DNA is tightly wound around histone proteins, forming what we call chromatin. To even start, you have to physically open it up.
And the system for signaling that is called the histone code.
Right. It refers to all these chemical modifications, mostly on the tails of the histone proteins. The most famous one is acetylation of lysine residues. Lysines are positively charged, which helps them grip the negatively charged DNA.
But if you add an acetyl group, you neutralize that charge.
You do, and that loosens the grip, making the DNA more accessible. So generally, histone acetylation is a mark of active or potentially active genes.
And there's a whole suite of machinery to manage this code.
A whole team. You have code writers, the enzymes like histone acetalases that put the marks on. You have code erasers like deacetylases that take them off. And maybe most importantly, you have code readers.
What do the readers do?
They're proteins that have specific domains that recognize and bind to a particular modification. And when they bind, they often recruit huge ATP-powered chromatin remodeling complexes that can physically slide nucleosomes around or even kick them off the DNA entirely.
And it's not just the histones that get modified. The DNA itself can be marked.
DNA methylation. Adding a methyl group to cytosine bases, especially in so-called CpG islands, is another major way to signal keep out. It's generally a mark for long-term silencing.
All of this machinery then has to be coordinated by regulatory elements like enhancers.
Enhancers are amazing. They're DNA sequences that can be tens of thousands of base pairs away from the gene they control. They can be upstream, downstream, even in a different orientation.
How on earth do they work from so far away?
They bind specific activator proteins, and these proteins then recruit coactivators that can loop the DNA around, physically bringing the distant enhancer into contact with the promoter region of the gene.
The sources have a fantastic example of this in action, the beta interferon enhancisome.
Yes, it's a perfect illustration of combinatorial control. When a cell gets infected by a virus, 4 different types of transcription factors all have to bind to their specific sites in the enhancer region.
But there's a key fifth player, right? An architectural protein.
Exactly, HMG,
Yeah.
IY. Its job isn't to activate transcription directly, but to bend the DNA at strategic points. These bends allow all the other factors to fit together perfectly, cooperatively, into a single three-dimensional structure.
Key enhancisome.
That's the one. And it's the specific shape of this entire complex, this structure, that provides the landing pad to recruit the chromatin modifiers and the rest of the transcriptional machinery. It leads to a more than 100-fold boost in transcription. It's not just the parts, it's how they assemble in 3D space.
So let's dig into the structure of these proteins themselves. We saw the helix-turn-helix motif in the lambda repressor. What are the other major designs these proteins use to recognize specific DNA sequences?
Well, beyond helix-turn-helix, a very common one in eukaryotes is the zinc finger.
As in a finger-like projection of the protein that's held in shape by a zinc ion.
That's exactly it. The zinc is usually coordinated by cysteine and histidine residues, and it acts like a scaffold. It stabilizes this little domain so it can poke into the major groove of the DNA. Proteins can have a whole series of these fingers, one after another, to read a longer DNA sequence.
And this isn't just a structural curiosity.
Not at all. There are direct clinical links. For example, a single amino acid change in one of the zinc fingers of the vitamin D3 receptor is enough to cause rickets, because the receptor can no longer bind its target DNA sequences properly.
Okay, so we have helix-turn-helix and zinc fingers. What's the third major motif?
The leucine zipper. This one is a bit different because it's mainly a dimerization motif.
Meaning it helps 2 protein molecules stick together.
Right. You have an alpha helix where every 7th amino acid is a leucine. This creates a strip of leucines down one side of the helix. 2 of these helices can then interlock or zip together to form a stable dimer.
Like the phosgene complex.
A classic example. The zipper part holds the 2 proteins together, which in turn positions their DNA binding domains in just the right orientation to grab onto a symmetric DNA sequence.
Okay, let's circle back to those type C irreversible changes. You mentioned them being heritable, which brings us to the field of epigenetics.
Right. Of genetics. These are changes to expression patterns that are passed down through cell division, but don't involve any change to the actual DNA sequence itself.
So how does a cell remember its identity after it divides? The sources describe 2 main ways.
The first is through transsignals. This is where you have a transcription factor that activates its own gene.
A positive feedback loop again.
Exactly. So the cell has a pool of this protein. When it divides, each daughter cell gets half the protein, which is enough to kickstart the loop again. The signal is the protein itself, which is diffusible.
And the other mechanism is cis signals, which are marks directly on the chromosome.
Yes. For DNA methylation, this is really elegant. After DNA replication, the new DNA is hemimethylated. The old strand has the methyl marks, but the new one doesn't.
And the cell has enzymes that recognize that hemimethylated state.
It does. Maintenance methyloses see that pattern and immediately add methyl groups to the new strand, perfectly copying the silencing pattern. A similar thing happens with histone marks. A complex can read a mark on an old histone and write the same mark onto the adjacent new one.
So we've gone from opening up DNA to initiating transcription. But the regulation doesn't stop there.
Not by a long shot. Once you have that primary RNA transcript, a whole new world of post-transcriptional control opens up.
Starting with things like non-coding RNAs or ncRNAs.
Right, these little RNAs, typically about 22 nucleotides long, like miRNAs and siRNAs, they are the fine-tuning knobs of gene expression. They bind to target messenger RNAs.
And what happens then depends on how well they match up.
That's the key. If the small RNA binds with a perfect match, it's a death sentence for the mRNA. It gets targeted for immediate degradation.
But if it's an imperfect match?
Then it typically just blocks translation. The mRNA isn't destroyed, it's just temporarily silenced. It's an incredibly subtle way to modulate protein output.
Then there's the idea of generating lots of different products from a single gene through alternative processing.
This is a huge source of protein diversity. You can have alternative promoters or different polyadenylation sites. The classic example is the immunoglobulin heavy chain, which can use one site to make a secreted antibody or another site to make a version that stays anchored in the cell membrane.
And the most common version of this is alternative splicing.
By far, it's amazing. The gene for alpha-tropomyosin, for instance, can be spliced in 7 different ways to produce 7 unique proteins, each one tailored for a specific tissue, like skeletal muscle or smooth muscle, all from one gene.
And finally, even after all that, the cell controls the stability of the mRNA itself. How long does it get to stick around?
And mRNA's lifespan, its half-life, is tightly regulated. Some are incredibly stable, others are designed to be destroyed in minutes. This is often controlled by proteins that bind to sequences in the untranslated regions, the UTRs, and target the message for degradation.
Wow. So we've gone from the simple, beautiful logic of the bacterial lac operon.
Through the life or death binary switch of the lambda-phage, all the way to this massively complex, multi-layered system in eukaryotes. Chromatin enhancers, modular proteins, RNA interference.
The big takeaway for you, listening, has to be the sheer modularity and combinatorial nature of it all. Life doesn't use one master switch. It uses hundreds of small ones, both positive and negative, layered on top of each other.
And every single step is a potential control point. From the physical accessibility of the DNA itself, all the way to how long the final protein lasts before it's degraded. It's all about information management.
Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on.
So, if we know that mistakes in this incredibly complex system are the root of diseases like cancer, here's the question for you. Looking at all these control points, which targets do you think hold the most promise for the next waves of therapies? Is it the enzymes that write the epigenetic code, the big chromatin remodeling machines, or maybe those tiny non-coding RNAs?
That's the question that drives so much of modern biomedical research. A really powerful thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a clear, step-by-step path through this incredible landscape.
A warm thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team.